Germany, 1945 to 1948. When survival rewrote the meaning of love. In the ruins of post-war Germany, a gold wedding ring couldn't feed your children, but a Hershey chocolate bar from an American soldier could keep your family alive for a week. Between 1945 and 1949, 15,000 German women made an impossible choice: marry the enemy or starve. This is the story of when chocolate meant more than forever. Picture this. A woman stands in the rubble of what used to be her neighborhood, holding a small brown wrapper in one hand and a thin gold band in the other. The wrapper once contained a Hershey chocolate bar given to her by an American soldier 3 days ago. The ring belonged to her grandmother, passed down through generations as a symbol of eternal love and commitment. In 1946 Germany, one of these objects could buy her family's survival for a week. The other was worthless. She chose the chocolate. This is not a story about romance. This is a story about what happens when hunger rewrites every rule you thought you knew about love, dignity, and what it means to be human. Germany, spring of 1945. The war had ended, but the dying had not. In the cities that remained standing, women picked through mountains of brick and twisted metal, searching for anything useful: a bent nail, a scrap of cloth, a can with something, anything, still inside. The men were gone. Dead in Stalingrad, captured in France, missing somewhere in the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. Those who survived were held in prisoner camps scattered across Europe and beyond. What remained were women, children, and the elderly, left to navigate a country that no longer functioned. The stores were empty. The factories were silent. The currency was worthless. A loaf of bread, if you could find one, cost more than a month's wages. But wages meant nothing when there were no jobs, no economy, no system left to hold society together. Before the war, Germany had been a nation of order and tradition. Weddings were grand affairs, even for ordinary families. A bride wore white, her hair carefully arranged, flowers in her hands. The groom placed a ring on her finger, a circle of gold that symbolized eternity, fidelity, a bond that could not be broken. Families gathered, toasts were made, and the couple began their life together under the watchful eyes of parents and community. The wedding ring was sacred. It was not just jewelry. It was a promise, a piece of identity, a marker of respectability. Women wore their rings with pride, and losing one was unthinkable. But that was before the bombs fell, before the ration cards ran out, before the men disappeared and the children began to starve. By 1943, the war had already begun to hollow out daily life. Rationing tightened. Butter, meat, and sugar became luxuries. Women learned to stretch meals, boiling potato peels into soup, baking bread from sawdust mixed with flour. Letters from the front grew fewer. Families waited by the radio, listening to reports of victories that sounded increasingly desperate. Then came the bombings. Night after night, the sirens wailed. Families huddled in basements and shelters, listening to the roar of engines overhead, the whistle of falling bombs, the thunder of explosions that shook the earth. When they emerged, entire streets had vanished. Neighbors were gone, homes reduced to ash and rubble. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany in early 1945, the country was already broken. The final collapse came swiftly. In April, Soviet forces encircled Berlin. American and British troops pushed in from the west. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, but for the civilians left behind, a new kind of suffering was just beginning. The infrastructure was destroyed. Roads were impassable. Trains no longer ran. Bridges had been bombed into rivers. The postal system collapsed. Banks closed. The Reichsmark, already weakened by inflation, became nearly worthless. In the cities, people bartered for survival: a watch for a sack of potatoes, a coat for a few eggs. Jewelry, even wedding rings, were traded for food. The symbols of the old world meant nothing when your children were crying from hunger. Then the occupiers arrived. Germany was divided into 4 zones, controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. In the American zone, which covered much of southern Germany, including Bavaria and parts of Hesse, the presence of U.S. soldiers became a daily reality. They came in trucks and jeeps. their uniforms clean and pressed, their faces well-fed and confident. They set up headquarters in requisitioned buildings, established checkpoints, and began the work of occupation. For the German civilians, especially the women, the sight of these soldiers was deeply unsettling. These were the men who had bombed their cities, killed their husbands and brothers, destroyed their country. And yet they looked nothing like the defeated, starving population around them. They looked like they had never missed a meal. The contrast was staggering. American soldiers carried packs filled with supplies, rations that seemed impossibly abundant. They had cigarettes, coffee, canned goods, chocolate. They chewed gum, a strange habit that fascinated German children. They drove vehicles that actually worked, wore boots that were not falling apart, and spoke in loud, confident voices. To the women digging through rubble, these soldiers seemed to come from another planet, a planet where the war had not destroyed everything, a planet where food was still plentiful, where life continued as normal. And in a way, they did. America had not been bombed. Its cities were intact, its factories were running at full capacity. Its people, though touched by the war, had not starved. The winter of 1945 to 1946 became known as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. It was one of the coldest winters on record, and it arrived at the worst possible time. With no fuel for heating, families burned furniture, books, anything that would catch fire. With no food in the stores, people ate whatever they could find: grass, tree bark, rats. In the cities, the official ration was often below 1,000 calories per day, far less than what a human body needs to survive. Children stopped growing. The elderly simply lay down and did not wake up. Women, already exhausted from years of war, grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at the stomach, clouding the mind, making every decision a calculation of survival. In this environment, morality shifted. The rules that had governed life before the war, the codes of honor and respectability, began to crack under the weight of necessity. A woman who would never have spoken to a strange man now approached American soldiers, hoping for a cigarette to trade. A mother who had once been proud now begged for scraps outside the military kitchens. Dignity became a luxury no one could afford, and the soldiers noticed. Some were sympathetic, others were opportunistic. The official policy was clear. Fraternization with German civilians was forbidden. The U.S. military command issued strict orders. Soldiers were not to socialize with the enemy, not to form relationships, not to blur the lines between occupier and occupied. But rules, no matter how strict, cannot override human nature. And as the months passed, those lines began to blur. It started small. A soldier tossing a candy bar to a group of children, a woman asking for a light, and the soldier offering a cigarette instead. Conversations, halting and awkward, conducted in broken English and broken German. The soldiers were young, far from home, lonely. The women were desperate, hungry, and in many cases, alone. The exchanges began as transactions: a chocolate bar for a smile, a pack of cigarettes for an hour of conversation, coffee, real coffee, for something more. But not all of it was transactional. Some soldiers genuinely wanted to help. Some women genuinely felt a connection. The line between survival and affection, between necessity and choice, was not always clear, and in the chaos of post-war Germany, clarity was a rare commodity. The Hershey bar became a symbol. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, stamped with a name that meant nothing to most Germans, but it represented something far larger. It was sweet, a taste that had disappeared from German life years ago. It was rich, made with real milk and sugar, ingredients that had become almost mythical, and it was abundant. American soldiers had access to these bars through the PX, the Post Exchange, a military store that stocked goods from home. To the soldiers, a Hershey bar was nothing special. A snack, a piece of childhood, something to share or trade without a second thought. But to a German woman who had not tasted chocolate in years, who had watched her children grow thin and weak, that bar was a miracle. It was proof that somewhere, life was still normal, that somewhere people still had enough. And so the Hershey bar became more than food. It became currency. It became courtship. It became hope. A soldier offering a chocolate bar to a woman was not just being kind. He was offering her a glimpse of a world where abundance still existed, a world where she might, if she played her cards right, find a place. Because by 1946, it was becoming clear that some of these relationships were leading somewhere permanent. The soldiers were going home, and some of them wanted to take their German girlfriends with them. The wedding ring, once the ultimate symbol of commitment, now sat in drawers and pockets, gathering dust. What good was a gold band when it could not fill a stomach? What good was a promise of forever when today was uncertain? Women who had dreamed of traditional weddings, of white dresses and family gatherings, now found themselves making different calculations. A German man, if he returned from the war, would return broken, traumatized, and just as poor as everyone else. He could offer companionship, perhaps, but not security. An American soldier, on the other hand, could offer food, protection, and most tantalizing of all, a ticket out, a chance to leave the ruins behind and start over in a country that had not been destroyed. This was the choice that thousands of German women faced, and many of them chose the chocolate, not because they were heartless or mercenary, but because survival demanded it, because love, in its traditional sense, was a luxury they could no longer afford. Because when your child is starving, you do not think about romance. You think about the next meal, and if that meal comes from the hand of a man in an American uniform, then so be it. The shame was real. The judgment was harsh. Women who associated with American soldiers were called names. Ami Liebchen, American sweethearts, said with a sneer. Collaborators, traitors, whores. The insults came from neighbors, from family, from other women who were making the same calculations but refused to admit it. The social stigma was intense, but it was not enough to stop the tide. Because the truth was, the Americans had what everyone needed: food, warmth, safety, and for some women the promise of a future that did not involve digging through rubble for the rest of their lives. The relationships that formed in this context were complicated. Some were purely transactional, cold exchanges of goods for companionship. Others were more ambiguous, a mix of genuine affection and practical necessity. And yes, some were real. Some of these couples fell in love, despite the circumstances, despite the power imbalance, despite the war that had brought them together. But even in those cases, the shadow of survival loomed large. How could a woman ever be sure of her own feelings when hunger was always present? How could she separate love from need when the two were so deeply intertwined? One woman, years later, described it this way: I met him in the spring of 1946. I was 23 years old, and I weighed less than I had at 15. My mother was sick. My younger brother was so weak he could barely stand. We had nothing. No food, no fuel, no hope. And then this soldier, this American, he gave me a chocolate bar. Just like that. He smiled and handed it to me, and I stood there holding it and I started to cry. Not because I was grateful, though I was, but because I realized that to him, this was nothing. He had more. He would always have more. And I thought, if I stay with him, maybe I will have more too, maybe I will survive. I did not love him then. I do not know if I ever loved him, but I married him, and I came to America, and I survived. This was the reality for thousands of women. The decision to marry an American soldier was not made lightly, but it was made quickly, because opportunities did not last. The soldiers were rotating out, heading home, and if a woman wanted to secure her future, she had to act. The U.S. military, recognizing the growing number of these relationships, passed the War Brides Act in December 1945. The law allowed American servicemen to bring their foreign wives and children to the United States, bypassing the usual immigration quotas. It was a bureaucratic solution to a human problem, and it opened the floodgates. Between 1945 and 1949, approximately 15,000 German women married American soldiers and emigrated to the United States. 15,000 women who left behind everything they knew, everyone they loved, to cross the ocean with men they had known for months, sometimes weeks. The process was not simple. There were interviews, background checks, medical examinations. The military wanted to ensure that these women were not security risks, that they were healthy, that the marriages were legitimate. The women had to prove that they were not prostitutes, not communists, not criminals. They had to submit to inspections, answer invasive questions, and wait for approval. For many, the process was humiliating, but it was also their only chance. And so they endured it, filling out forms, standing in lines, hoping that the bureaucracy would move quickly enough. Because every day they stayed in Germany was another day of hunger, another day of uncertainty, another day closer to losing their chance. When the approvals came, the women packed what little they had, a few clothes, photograph, sometimes a letter from a family member, a keepsake to carry across the ocean. They said goodbye to their mothers, their siblings, their friends. Some families were supportive, relieved that their daughter or sister would have a better life. Others were bitter, accusing the women of abandoning them, of choosing the enemy over their own blood. The goodbyes were painful, but they were final, because once the women boarded the ships, there was no coming back. Not for years, maybe not ever. The journey across the Atlantic was long and uncomfortable. The ships were crowded, filled with war brides from across Europe, all heading to the same uncertain future. The women shared cramped quarters, seasickness, and fear. They spoke different languages, came from different countries, but they shared the same questions. What would America be like? Would their husbands' families accept them? Would they be able to adapt? Would they be happy? The answers would come soon enough. But for now, all they could do was wait, watching the gray ocean roll past, leaving Europe and the war behind. When the ships docked in New York, the women stepped onto American soil for the first time. The sight of the city, tall and intact, was overwhelming. There were no ruins here, no bombed-out buildings, no rubble in the streets. Everything was clean, orderly, functioning. The women were processed through immigration, their papers checked, their names recorded, and then they were released, sent off to meet their husbands or to travel to their new homes. For many, the destination was a small town in the Midwest or the South, places they had never heard of, places that seemed impossibly far from the Germany they had left behind. The culture shock was immediate and profound. America was loud. It was bright. It was abundant. The grocery stores were full, shelves stocked with more food than the women had seen in years. Meat, fresh vegetables, bread, milk, and yes, chocolate. Rows and rows of chocolate. The women walked through these stores in a daze, unable to believe what they were seeing. Their husbands, used to this abundance, did not understand why their wives stood frozen in the aisles, tears streaming down their faces. But the women understood. They understood that they had crossed into a world where hunger was not a constant threat, where survival was not a daily struggle, and that realization was both a relief and a wound. Meeting the in-laws was another challenge. Some American families welcomed their new daughters-in-law with open arms, eager to help them adjust, to make them feel at home. But others were less kind. The war was still fresh in everyone's minds. Many Americans had lost sons, brothers, fathers in the fighting. And now their boys were bringing home German women, women from the enemy nation, women who spoke with accents and cooked strange food and did not understand American customs. The resentment was real. Some mothers refused to speak to their sons' wives. Some communities whispered and pointed. The women, already isolated by language and culture, felt the weight of that judgment. They had escaped one kind of suffering only to find another. And then there was the question that haunted many of these marriages. What happens when survival is no longer the bond? In Germany, the relationship had been built on need. The woman needed food, protection, a way out. The soldier needed companionship, affection, someone to make him feel human in the midst of occupation. But in America, those needs no longer existed. The woman was no longer starving. The soldier was no longer lonely. What remained? For some couples, the answer was love. Real, genuine love that had grown despite the circumstances, that had survived the transition from war to peace. These marriages thrived. The women learned English, made friends, built lives. They raised children who grew up American, who never fully understood what their mothers had endured. But for others, the answer was nothing. Without the pressure of survival, the cracks in the relationship became visible. The soldier realized he had married a stranger, someone he barely knew, someone he had nothing in common with. The woman realized she had traded one kind of prison for another, that she was trapped in a foreign country with a man she did not love, in a culture that did not want her. These marriages collapsed. Some women returned to Germany, humiliated and heartbroken. Others stayed, enduring unhappy marriages because they had no other choice. The statistics are hard to pin down, but estimates suggest that a significant percentage of these war bride marriages ended in divorce within the first few years. The children of these unions grew up between two worlds. They had German mothers and American fathers. They heard stories of the war, of hunger, of survival, but those stories felt distant, almost unreal. How could they understand what their mothers had been through when they had grown up in a country of plenty? Some children felt pride in their heritage. Others felt shame, embarrassed by their mother's accents, by the whispers of neighbors, by the knowledge that their parents' marriage had been born out of desperation. The generational divide was deep, and it left scars that lasted long after the war had ended. Back in Germany, the country slowly began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, poured billions of dollars into European recovery. Factories reopened. Infrastructure was repaired. The economy, which had been in ruins, began to grow. By the 1950s, Germany was experiencing what would later be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The hunger that had defined the post-war years faded. Food became plentiful again. The black markets closed. The desperate calculations of survival gave way to something closer to normal life. And as the country recovered, the values that had been suspended during the crisis began to reassert themselves. The wedding ring regained its meaning. Traditional courtship returned. The women who had married American soldiers, who had traded chocolate for a chance at survival, were quietly forgotten, or worse, remembered with judgment. Many of these women never spoke about their experiences. The shame was too deep. The choices they had made, necessary as they were, did not fit the narrative of post-war Germany. The country wanted to move forward, to rebuild, to forget the humiliation of defeat. The women who had left, who had chosen the enemy, were an uncomfortable reminder of that humiliation. And so they stayed silent, carrying their stories alone. In America, they tried to assimilate, to blend in, to become the wives and mothers their new country expected them to be. But the memories remained. The taste of that first Hershey bar, the weight of the wedding ring left behind, the impossible choice between dignity and survival. Historians have struggled to make sense of this period. How do you judge women who made choices under conditions of extreme duress? How do you separate exploitation from agency when the power dynamics were so unequal? Some scholars argue that these women were victims, coerced by hunger and desperation into relationships they would never have chosen otherwise. Others argue that they were survivors, making rational decisions in an irrational world, using the only resources they had to secure their futures. The truth, as always, is more complicated. These women were both victims and agents. They were shaped by forces beyond their control, but they also made choices, difficult choices, choices that required courage and pragmatism in equal measure. What this period reveals, more than anything, is the brutal reality of survival. When the structures of society collapse, when the safety nets disappear, when hunger becomes the dominant fact of life, people do what they must. Morality becomes flexible. Symbols lose their meaning. A wedding ring, once sacred, becomes just another piece of metal to be traded. A chocolate bar, once trivial, becomes a lifeline. The women who lived through this understood something that those who came after could not, that survival is not noble. It is not romantic. It is not a story with clear heroes and villains. It is messy, painful, and deeply human. The legacy of the Hershey bar and the wedding ring is not found in grand narratives or historical monuments. It is found in the quiet stories of individual women, stories that were rarely told and even more rarely heard. It is found in the letters that were never sent, the diaries that were burned, the conversations that ended in silence. It is found in the children who grew up not quite understanding why their mothers flinched at certain questions, why they hoarded food, why they never threw anything away. It is found in the small, everyday acts of survival that added up to a life. And perhaps that is the lesson. War does not just destroy buildings and kill soldiers. It destroys the structures that give life meaning. It strips away the symbols and rituals that hold society together. It forces people to make choices that no one should have to make. And in doing so, it reveals the uncomfortable truth that humanity is not defined by our ideals, but by what we do when those ideals are no longer possible. The women who chose the Hershey bar over the wedding ring were not betraying love. They were redefining it. They were saying that love, in its truest form, is not about symbols or promises. It is about survival. It is about doing whatever it takes to protect yourself and the people you care about. It is about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Today, the story of the German war brides is largely forgotten. The women who made that journey are mostly gone now, their stories buried with them. But the questions they faced, the choices they made, remain relevant. Because the world is still full of people making impossible choices. Refugees fleeing war zones. Families torn apart by conflict. Women navigating systems of power that were not designed for them. The specifics change, but the underlying reality does not. Survival is still survival. Hunger is still hunger. And the choice between dignity and necessity is still one that millions of people face every day. So when we look back at the women who stood in the ruins of Germany, holding a Hershey bar in one hand and a wedding ring in the other, we should not judge them. We should recognize them. We should see in their choices the same calculations that people make in every war, in every crisis, in every moment when the world falls apart. We should remember that they were not weak. They were not immoral. They were human. And they did what humans do when pushed to the edge. They survived. The Hershey bar meant more than a wedding ring because in that moment, in that place, survival meant more than symbolism. And that is not a failure of love. It is a testament to the strength it takes to keep living when everything else has been taken away. The women who made that choice carried the weight of it for the rest of their lives. But they also carried something else. The knowledge that they had endured, that they had made it through, that they had chosen life even when life demanded everything from them. And in the end, that is the story worth remembering. Not the chocolate or the ring, but the women who held them. The women who survived. The women who crossed an ocean and built new lives in a foreign land. The women who never forgot where they came from, but who also never stopped moving forward. They were the ones who understood better than anyone that sometimes the greatest act of courage is not dying for your ideals, but living without them. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe for more true accounts of World War II history. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us of the choices humans make in the darkest hours, choices that reveal who we really are. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What would you have done in their position? Let's keep these conversations alive.